Hello and welcome to this video, which is going to be my update 44 PvP sort of battleground healer build. I've done quite a lot, I think 3 of these before. So if you haven't watched those previous videos, this is going to sort of build on top. And what I'm mostly going to talk about in this video is what changes are coming to battlegrounds with update 44 and how are we going to update the build for update 44. So there's a couple of important changes coming to Battlegrounds with update 44. The most important one being that this game mode is no longer going to be a 3-team game mode. It's now going to be always a 2-team game mode. So it's going to be your team versus another team. What is also going to change is that previously there's only one queue. There was of course a group queue and solo queue, but there was only one game mode. So what is going to change here is that this team size is going to change depending on 2 modes. There's going to be a 8-team size, which the SOS team has referred to as the casual mode. So this is for you to just jump in, play some. There's not going to be any sort of competitive leaderboard or score related to it. And then there's also going to be a competitive mode. So this is going to be a team size 4 mode instead, where there's going to be a leaderboard, there's going to be some competitive rewards, etc. So a lot like what we see with Tales of Tribute, it's basically going to look like this: unranked, casual, competitive, but for the battlegrounds instead. So those are sort of the major changes coming to Battlegrounds next patch. And now I want to go into how we address this. So how I've addressed this is that I've made a couple of builds, and first I want to discuss the casual mode. And the first build I want to discuss is what I would call sort of the easily slottable casual build. So this is for the 8v8 mode. What we're using is Ocean as we were using before, too heavy. Then we're using the Gallant Chain as before, Transmutation as well as before, but the big change is Saxiel's champion. So instead of wearing a sort of what is a quote-unquote selfish set, we're now using a buff set as our second set. And that is basically it. We are again only wearing it on the back bar to allow us to use the Death Dealer's Fete, which is a very nice buff to have as well. So how it looks here, we have a Saxiel on the back bar, Transportation on the front bar, only active on the front bar. So of course, to address this, we also need to wear different ultimate. The ultimate we're going to use is now Barrier. On the front bar we're using Undo until we can later on morph it into the morph that gives us a little damage mitigation buff. This is of course a dead slot, so if you want to wear something else you can as well. There's an option to wear Dawnbreaker, Meteor, whatever you want on the front bar. So that is pretty much it for sort of the changes to the sort of the easily slottable casual build compared to what it was before. Why did we make these changes? So what happened is now that instead of having 4 teammates, you now have 8 teammates, but the amount of enemies that you're facing is the same. So before you're facing 8 enemies, now you're facing 8 enemies. Of course, there's a big change in that these enemies are now all on the same team, so no longer fighting each other. They can now buff each other. But essentially, you have twice as many allies now that can buff you and cross heal you and stuff. So there's really no justifying wearing a selfish set. We might as well wear a grief buff set. Of course, also now that we're 8 teammates, you're buffing a lot more people with your group support sets, and that is why I think Saxiel is a very good fit. This is a very easy set to use. Now of course what Saxiel does is that it gives your group members within 28 meters major force for a certain amount of time, a very long time if it's a maximally charged ultimate, and this increases the critical damage done. Of course the meta right now is pretty much that you're relying on a quick succession of critical strikes to sort of burst down your enemies. So this is a very, very useful buff to provide to your teammates who are probably relying on these critical strikes to kill the enemies. So now they're going to be doing another 20% on top of that critical damage modifier. So if that was 100% before, well, that's a 10% damage increase to the in total, or to their critical strike, and that's quite a big damage increase. So that is why we're using Saxiel's champion. And Otherwise, this build pretty much remains the same as before. One change that's come is, of course, we now have scribe skills. The scribe skills aren't that good for healers, in my opinion. But I like this healing bond. Of course, you need a resto staff to use this skill, and what it does is that it creates a beam between you and an ally. And in this link, you're healing them. Then, if they leave the link, they'll get a damage shield. You can also choose the healing morph here. And then there's a buff, which is minor heroism to anyone that touches the beam, excluding yourself. So you're not getting this minor heroism, and that's important to remember. But this is a very nice buff. Ultimate is a very, very good buff. It's also a rare buff. Minor heroism doesn't appear on a lot of things. So the chances are your teammates won't have access to this buff, and this is going to help them reach an ultimate. Especially the Dragon Knights will like this. But Dragon Knights that are relying on this will typically also have access to minor heroism themselves, though. So that is pretty much it for the changes to sort of the casual builds. Then there's another build I made for this 8v8 mode, which is this one. And this one is going to be a little bit different. So what is probably going to happen a lot is that there's going to be another healer on your team. This already happens quite a lot in 4-man battlegrounds. It's probably going to happen even more in 8-man battlegrounds. And what happens to what happens typically is that you will have overlapping buffs, so they will be carrying the same buffs as you. This build tries to avoid that, so that you can actually work in tandem. So this is sort of the build to use if you have another healer on your team. With this build, you go from being more of a healer to actually being more of a support DD. So what this build is that it's the mix of pillagers and Saxiel. So you have them both at the same time. Of course, to have them both at the same time, you need both of them to be active at the same time, which means we can no longer wear Osis on. But otherwise, but otherwise we still have some of the same skills and so on. But we are wearing pillagers on both bars, so we need to wear this. I'm wearing this on 4 body pieces currently, and then 1 ring. And then we're wearing Saxiel just on the back bar, and it's very important that we still only use our ultimate on the back bar. Of course, to get as much use out of these 2 sets as possible, we're going to be using Pulse of Endlofate to farm ultimate. And what this set does is that if you burn down your Magicka, which is not too difficult playing a healer, and your casting skills under 50% Magicka, well, then you're getting ultimate with every healing cast, and this ultimate is eventually you'll spend on buffing your allies. So the idea here is that we have 2 sets that proc on your ultimate, and this is going to be pretty massive in that you give your allies a lot of major force, and then they also get a lot of ultimate over a few seconds so that they can cast their ultimate and do as much damage as possible. Then we wear a single piece of Magma Incarnate because we can't wear a monster set when this set up. Then on the front bar, because we have a free slot, then we can wear an arena staff, and the arena staff that I recommend that you use is the Black Roar staff. That's the most powerful one to wear. So this is sort of more of a group support setup than a healing setup, as I said, but that also makes a lot of sense, because once we reach 8-man, we're actually looking more towards the ball groups in terms of how we build our builds than we actually look towards small scale PvP. So it's a very sort of ball group / PvE raid group inspired build. And I recommend that you use this one if you have another healer in your group, because that healer is most likely going to be using Rallying Cry, Transmutation, Osis and Spell Cure, these sort of sets. One thing to watch out for, when you're reaching 8-man, remember that Rallying Cry is not as a powerful set. This set of course gets weaker the more group members you have, so it's a lot worse in an 8-man group than it is in a 4-man group. So I recommend that you use Transmutation over Rallying Cry. Of course not on this setup, but on the trans setup. But you can still use Rallying Cry. So if someone else is using Transmutation, you can slot Rallying Cry instead, to sort of not overlap buffs. So that's pretty much it for the 8v8 casual mode setups, and next I'm going to be talking about the competitive mode. So this is me coming in later, remembering that I forgot to mention something. So how do you know if your group members are in range of these 2 sets, so Saxiel and Pillager's Prophet? Of course, Pillager's Prophet has a 12 meter range, and so does Barrier. And to address this, there are a lot of add-ons that track how many group members are in range. But I made this add-on as well, which is part of a Citizen add-on pack. This is a pack that contains a lot of different add-ons, which you can turn on. Some you can see here. There's a blocking add-on. There's a resistance meter. But I also commissioned City to make an add-on that basically this is a meter that you can decide for yourself in number of meters. So you can see here this can scroll between 5 and 36 meters. And it tracks how many group members are within this threshold. So you can decide for yourself how many meters you want to put this at. I recommend using 12 meters because this is the range of your barrier and pillage's profit. But if, for example, you're just using Saxiel, you can put this up at the Saxiel range instead. Or if you're using something like Ignis Weapons, you can put it at the Ignis Weapons range. There are other add-ons that does the same thing, but what I like about this one is that you have a lot more control over it. You can decide for yourself where you want to put this at. So just something I recommend doing if you're going to use these sets. So in terms of the competitive mode setup, I've made quite a lot of changes. So previously my setups have been sort of a good mix. I feel like at least I've tried to make a good mix of what is sort of accessible and what is viable. So I've been trying to make builds that weren't too difficult to farm and get access to and play at the same time as being relatively viable and competitive in the game modes themselves. And this build is different. So this is the builds I've been playing a lot over the last 6 months, of course, in this crit meta. But it diverges quite a lot from what I usually would be making. So what is changed with this setup compared to what we had before is, of course, we're wearing 2 buff sets. We're wearing Rallying Cry and we're wearing Transmutation. So this, of course, requires wearing a lot of light armor. You no longer have a selfish set, but I feel like it compensates well for it in the sense that both the sets that we are using, the buff sets we're using, are defensive buff sets. And it's actually 3 defensive buff sets if you also count Osis on. What I'm trying to do with this build is to counter the crit meta that we've seen. Of course, crit meta is, as I've explained, quick succession of critical strikes, usually with the proc set. If you've been hearing Shattered Windows, you probably know what I'm talking about. Of course, that set is getting nerfed next patch, but this meta is probably going to persist for a long time. And what this setup is made to do is reduce the damage of those bosses by a significant amounts. And this, these 2 sets together is close to a 50% reduction to the critical damage modifier that the enemy have. Now, how much damage reduction that is depends on how much critical damage modifier they have, but it is a significant damage reduction to these busts, and that helps keep your crewmates alive. Of course, this comes at the cost of having a selfish set, and you are a lot more squishy in this setup than you were previously with the trial by fire setup. So that's the cost that comes with this. You will die more often using this setup, but it comes at the benefit of having 2 buff sets. How we achieve this and still remain alive is by actually buying 3 pieces of heavy armor through our monster set. So you'll have to craft new monster sets if you don't have these in heavy. Those are sun ones, because we keep the Gallant chained. But otherwise, the setup is pretty much the same as before. Of course, we still wearing Mending Bond here. So that is the setup for this sort of competitive 4v4 PvP mode. Now, I also want to present one last setup, which is the beginner setup. That setup is, of course, what we had before with Trial by Fire. Why are we using Trial by Fire? Well, Trial by Fire is a selfish set, of course, but Trial by Fire allows us to be almost immortal. It's a very, very big damage reduction. Once you're on the back bar and Trial by Fire is active, then you're going to take significantly less amount of damage, and this keeps you alive. Of course, the thought is you can't heal your team if you're dead, so you need to stay alive, and that is sort of, this is the build I recommend that you use if you just started PvP healing, because it's a good mix of, again, viability as well as accessibility. So if you're coming to this video and it's the first sort of interaction you have with PvP healing, I recommend that you go for this setup that is, I feel like, is crafted for a new player that wants to get into PvP healing. So this is sort of the beginner build. What is very nice about it is, of course, Trial by Fire is a crafted set. It's going to be very easy for you to slot this, with the exception of Death Dealer's Fete maybe, but you can craft Trials of Trial by Fire, you can buy Transmutation. Ocesan is a relatively easy dungeon to do on Veteran, and then you pretty much have this entire setup. So that is pretty much it for this video, and thank you for watching.